It's like he's just been cut out of their lives completely. So this piece is called Taken. Like I said, it's a short story, so I'm going to do it in a couple of bits. So here we go. Her smile was that grade of glittery shininess, the kind only achieved after hours of buffing. Its fake brittleness was like plastic left out in the sun too long, which would shatter with a touch. And she rushed around offering annoyingly eager service, talking too loudly and being overly polite. I felt like slapping her and telling her to shut the hell up, to come sit down and let's settle this. But I didn't. I was cool. In fact, I amazed myself at how cool I was able to remain, considering just how much she had pissed me off, how much she had upended my life, shaken it viciously, and watched everything I valued drop to the floor and shatter. We had been fighting off and on for about a year now. Why? For the same reason there are so many foreign men fought with their Japanese wives or ex-wives and former significant others over our kids, or more specifically, our right to see our children. In my case, it was the right to see my two children, Akiko and Jun, who, like the plot from some bad B-grade movie, had been spirited out of my life by my ex-wife Taiko. She, who was now rushing around in the restaurant where she worked as the assistant manager, and where I had come to see her to beg, no, bargain, for the right to see my own flesh and blood, who were now, according to the ridiculous, incredulous writ of Japanese law, for all intents and purposes, no longer my own children. Like so many before me, I had heard the horror stories. I even knew a few guys who this had happened to, like my Australian friend Chris, whose wife Junko had made off with his daughter in the dead of night, just in the time it took for him to nip out to the local 24-hour supermarket to pick up some milk and eggs for breakfast. He'd hardly been gone 30 minutes, but when he got back home on his bicycle, all the lights were on in the apartment, the stereo was still playing Johnny Mathis's Chances Are, and Junko and 6-year-old Aiko were gone. The note on the kitchen table said they had left for her mother's place out inside town and that he was not to come looking for them. Her story? It was the same one I was faced with now. So-called domestic abuse. Domestic abuse? Chris? As we say in Jamaica, him could have barely my chance. In other words, he's not a very aggressive person. His custody battle was well underway and, like mine, had no end in sight. Of course, when Chris had told me about what had happened to him one night over a beer at our favorite watering hole, I offered my commiserations but had no clue that that same fate was to overtake me. Domestic violence has always been a problem in Japan, as it has been just about everywhere else on earth. Japanese law had never offered much protection to women, but over the last 10 years or so, many strides have been made to protect Japanese women from some of the sadistic bastards they get involved with in this strongly male-dominated society. This, of course, is wonderful. The problem, though, is that, like with so many other things in this country, in the quest to protect women, something of an extreme position in the interpretation of these laws has all too often been adopted, to the extent where arguments between married couples or people in common law relationships where the only things that get thrown are words, and sometimes not even that, can be classified as domestic abuse. In these situations, again, the testimony of the man involved and his natural right to have access to his own offspring receive short shrift. What's up, Dave? Here you go. Japanese law, except in rare cases, does not permit joint custody of children, nor is the country a signatory to the international treaty, the Hague Convention, which makes it possible for men from foreign countries to have any kind of access to the children they have with Japanese women once they are taken back to Japan. The result of all this is that these women, often abetted by their families, and too often driven by xenophobia, both in the courts as well as in society, have a lot of power over the men they get involved with, and many of them use that power vindictively, and very often quite inexplicably. I mean, how and why the hell does a simple disagreement, which is too often the case, metastasize into a man being surgically excised from the life of his kids? This was the quagmire that my friend Chris, and now I, myself, had fallen into. As I sat there watching Taika doing her version of the quintessential Japanese-style Energizer Bunny, where the air of busyness was being conveyed, though very little was actually being accomplished, my mind went back, as it often did, to happier times. I thought about when we first met. She used to sit in the back of my classroom, right next to the door, with her best friend Akane. The pair of them had been inseparable. What had caught my eye was not just her looks, although she was, and still is, I had to admit, a very beautiful woman. Tall, elegant, curves in all the right places, a long, slightly angular face fronted by an aristocratic nose, wide, generous lips that seemed always ready to break into a smile, and long, jet black hair set off by that light golden olive complexion that some Japanese women have that makes them almost glow. But as fantastic as she looked, that was secondary to her slightly wacky but rapier-sharp wit, her most un-Japanese directness, and, it has to be said, that sexy voice, low and husky, light years away from the Minnie Mouse on helium voice that some Japanese girls insisted on adopting, and which invariably grated on my nerves like sandpaper. She had been a solid student, consistently getting good grades and usually in the top 1/3 of the class in terms of her results. I had been smitten by her almost from day one, and although I had done my best to maintain the teacher-student distance, I knew that it had only going to be a matter of time before I made a move. The age gap was not that wide, after all, so I didn't think I could have been accused of robbing the cradle. She had just turned 20 and I was 25, a year out of university after having completed my master's degree, and had arrived in Japan the year before as part of my quest to see the world. Taiko had been cool to the idea of going out with me at first, not wanting to mix business, as it were, with pleasure. After all, I was her teacher, and she was my student. And there were also rules against extracurricular and interaction between staff and students at the women's college we were both attached to. We compromised by maintaining regular email correspondence until the end of the year, when the term ended. After that, we went everywhere together, from diving off Izu to Fuji Rock, or just hanging out in coffee shops and bars, the quietest ones we could find, talking for hours, and later making plans for our future together. Of course, I had been smitten with her almost from day one. And to cut a long story short, after about a year, I asked her to marry me, and she said yes. It had not all been plain sailing though. Her parents had been dead set against us getting together, being the traditionalists they were, which seemed at odds with the worldly daughter they had raised. Still, Taiko, to her credit, had stuck to her guns, and I was the happiest man in the world the day we went to the local ward office and made it official. She had moved in with me soon after graduation, and we had a party in our apartment to celebrate our marriage with a few friends, much to the annoyance of my neighbors. I was the happiest man in the world. We looked forward to a good life together, and she seemed happy to become a wife and mother. We decided that we wanted children, and that we would live between Japan and Jamaica so that we would be able to spend time with our respective families, and, importantly, that our kids would grow up familiar with both sides of their heritage. Taika wanted to go on studying and get her master's degree, and so we moved to New York, where she went to school, and I got a job teaching at a community college. It was a crazy, busy, happy time. We were getting ahead with our lives, and although we were not making a lot of money, we got by. In the midst of all that, Akiko came along, and our life zipped along at an even faster clip, amidst never-ending diaper changes, daycare, and the 1,000,001 things that crop up with parenthood. I did most of the housework and childcare as Taiko slaved away at her master's thesis, and I was happy to do so. I enjoyed fatherhood, and Akiko was the proverbial apple of my eye. All right, I think I will leave it here for the time being. Thanks so much.
Give everybody a chance.